What's up, guys, and welcome back. In this tutorial series, I'm going to be covering the basics of X particles. Um, Looking around on the internet, I saw there's a lot of sort of like, here's how to do this in X particles, here's how to do that in X particles, but there's not too many just sort of introductions from the absolute bottom up explaining things, especially not ones that are recent. So I figured that was a nice sort of hole for me to fill. So in this tutorial, I'm just going to be kind of giving a broad overview of X particles, talking about in kind of just like I said, starting from the very beginning, like what even is a particle, and yep, just kind of how to wrap your brain around the whole system, sort of just like a top-down, big picture view. And we'll end things off with a quick demonstration, just so it's not just pure lecture and theory. But it's not really going to be much of a sort of like follow along demo. It's just kind of a uh, here's how quickly and easily you can build something in X particles, because that's one of the sort of strong points of X particles is that a lot of this stuff you could probably, you could put it together in different software. Obviously, a lot of the stuff that you could do in X Particles, you could do the same thing, say, for instance, in Houdini. But one of the big benefits of X Particles is just the speed and ease of which you can do some of these effects. Um, and say like if you wanted a lot of these effects, you could probably again do the same thing in something like Blender with like geometry nodes or something like that. But yeah, you'd be hard pressed to be able to do as cool looking and complex effects in some of these other software with the ease and speed that you can do it inside of X Particles. It's sort of just built for certain types of effects, kind of like motion graphics, particle effects, essentially. And it's really strong and really powerful towards that. So that said, let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so here we are back in Cinema 4D. This is version 2024.0.2 and X Particles, this build 2023.3, or the Insidium Fuse build 2023.3.1, and X Particles 1563. It's the most recent version as of right now, the one that they just released that works with 2024. All right, so starting off, let's again start at the very beginning. And you might think that at the beginning is the emitter, but before we even talk about the emitter, I want to just talk about a particle. Like what even is a particle? Most of you probably sort of like know what a particle is, um, but yeah, I like to start things off at the sort of like most basic point. So to begin to talk about that, I'm going to grab this thing in under Insidium X Particles utilities, and let's grab the XP console, and let's just stock this here, and let's make an emitter. And with that, I'm just going to say get active emitter. Now, what is a particle? At its sort of most basic, a particle is just a position in space. In the context of X particles, a particle is that position in space plus a bunch of attributes, which basically means that it's just a bunch of data that's attached to that particle, to that position in space. So an example of some of those attributes, if we go here into the XP console, you can see here it has PID, that's the particle ID, and then it has the particle's age. So those are a couple of attributes. If we come up here to say where it says data to display, you can see that we've got a whole lot of attributes. So these are all different pieces of data that are attached to the particle. So we've got color. Let's add a few of these on here. Let's add editor display. Let's add position, radius, let's do direction just for starters. So you can see that there's a bunch of different things that we can put on here, but we'll just start with these. So if we press play and we get some particles, you can see that this is now populated with information. If we go to the options, I'm just gonna change the update to on each frame so that this all animate. You can see if we just press play again, the position Z is changing for most of these, and the XY position is staying the same because these guys are all moving. Their XY position isn't changing, and obviously they're just moving along Z. You can see the particle radius is 3 for all the particles, so they just basically have some default values in here. And particle ID, which is sort of just like the number of each particle, and the particle age, which is like how long the particle has been alive. So if we scroll down this list, you'll just see they keep getting younger and younger. So the end of this list up here, this is the oldest particle. If we go all the way down, here's the youngest particle. So this is the one's particle ID 0 or 1 is probably over here, and whatever 3000 is over here. And you can see we've got color. So one of the things to take away from this is all these different attributes are just different types of data. So the color is just a vector. The particle ID is an integer. The particle age, since we're just going on whole frames, is an integer. The direction is a vector. You can see here the display type is, when we actually see the raw data, that's basically an integer, but if we look at the actual thing over here, you can see that's squares. So squares are 2. If we change this to dots, you can see the display type change to 0. So it's still data, but it just gets, it shows up as different stuff depending on, when you're just looking at it over here in the editor display, it just has a number associated with each one of these different display types. Obviously, position is a vector, radius is a float value. Let's change this now to circle. And the reason I want to change this to circle is so that we can actually see the radius. In these editor display types, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, the first 4 different display types don't actually show the particle radius. And this is really good for scenes where you have a ton of particles, because as the particle count dramatically increases, the display types that do show radius, like circles, like these, will ultimately slow down your viewport, and your viewport will be a lot faster with one of the first 4 types of displays. But let's look at circle so we can actually see the radius. And like I said, you can see that the radius is 3. If we go into the emitter and under radius, let's change the variation all the way up to 3. And let's actually do 2. You can see we've got particles of different sizes, and now you can see the radius is varying between each particle along with this variation. Okay. So again, that's basically it. That's really all a particle is. A particle is just a point in space, and then it has all these different attributes associated, all this data. And this data is going to correspond to some sort of setting on the particles. It's going to do something and so X particles is just set up to where, again, I'm showing this because this is sort of just like the raw data, but X particles is set up in a way that just sort of like makes human readable sense for all this information. The radius is just obviously like the radius of the particle that you can see. The speed is how fast the particles are moving, all that sort of stuff, right? But the reason that it's really important to understand that, under the hood, it's all just data, it's all just numbers, is because ultimately, as you start to build more interesting and complex effects, you're going to want to do things like remap this data, drive other data with this data. Like, for example, if we can just do a very simple setup really quickly. If we come in here, let's go and add a Espresso tag. And let's drop our emitter in here. Let's just take this and dock it down here. So if we drag our emitter in here, and I'm just going to create a cube and make it a bit small, holding down Control to change all these at the same time. Okay, so if we take our emitter, and I'm just going to expose this object, okay, and we're going to also drop our cube in here. And let's create a constant. Where you are. Let's change this to an integer. And yeah, the integer can just be 0. And let's make a X particles data, and let's say get particle data. So we're going to drop the object into the emitter, and in the index, I'm just going to keep this at 0. So it's just going to be index 0. And on here, we're going to get the position. And before we plug this in, let's go in here and let's just grab this result. And let's change the data type to a vector. And plug that in. If we press play, you can see we've got a position. And what that position is the first particle. So now if we take this position, let's go in here, coordinates, go position, that, and let's drop that here. Then you can see that this data is usable, right? So this is just to show that, you've got all this data here. Each one of these particles has a bunch of numbers associated with it, and you can take that data and you can do stuff with it. That's a good thing to understand from the very beginning, because again, as things get more complex, you're going to be doing a lot with data. You're going to be moving data around, driving parameters with data, mapping different effects to data, all that sort of stuff. And you might want to do something as simple as this. It's just like lock a piece of geometry to a particle position. This can be pretty useful in and of itself. Okay, so that's what a particle is. It's just a position in space with a bunch of data. All right, let's get rid of some of this stuff. So now let's talk about the sort of big picture of X particles. And for that, I'm going to just use this guy, which is just all the different nodes. So even though we started with particle, really X particles starts with, if you want to build any sorts of effects with X particles, that starts with the emitter, because the emitter is how you actually create particles. And you can use a few different tools to create particles. And, depending on a few things, you can create particles in a few ways, but it always begins at an emitter. So the main idea here is that you use an emitter to create particles, but once you have particles, which again is just a position with a bunch of attributes, those attributes are then modified by aptly called modifiers, which is basically this entire group over here. So all these modifiers are going to ultimately work in some sort of way. They all work in a different way to modify those attributes of particles. That's the big overview. And you also have a bunch of dynamic modifiers, but I guess you could kind of sort of like call it tools and modifiers in here, because some of these things are really, really, just it's sort of weird to call them modifiers when some of these things do something very simple, and some of the stuff over here does stuff that's really complex, like the flip, there's fluid solvers, all this different stuff. But ultimately, it's just a tool to get the particles to do something. So you've got particles, particle has attributes, you've got modifiers, modifiers modify the attributes. And then you also have over here generators, where you can generate additional objects based on some sort of information that's coming from the particles. Then under here, we've just got a bunch of other random sort of tools and different things that you can use, utilities and stuff like that. And that's the major structure. You have an emitter to generate particles. You have modifiers that are going to modify the particles in some way. And then you have generators, where you can generate some other sort of object. It could be geometry, curves, different sorts of stuff. And it's mostly geometry and curves. And then we've just got like some utilities down here. So let's just look at a few really simple examples to just kind of break this down. We can go ahead and delete this cube and delete that. All right, so we made an emitter. By default, it has a bunch of settings in here that are, just the default settings. So like you can see, the default display type it wasn't boxes, it's squares. So this is what you're going to get if you just make an emitter and press play, right? Within the emitter itself, and I think that probably the next tutorial in this series is where I'm really going to talk about the emitter, because it's a lot to talk about, the emitter and all the different ways that you can emit particles. So we're not going to get too deep into that in this tutorial, but we have to talk about it a little bit. But within the emitter, you can change a lot of settings. So you saw before, I changed the display type here. So let's just change that again to circle so that we can see the radius. All right. And everything else I'm going to change with modifiers. One thing to mention is, if we look at this again, so you can see that we've got these red and orange modifiers over here, and all these green modifiers over here. So the difference here is that these guys are all processed on the GPU. So this is Nexus, and then the rest of these are the sort of like old system regular X particles processed on the CPU modifiers. What Insidium has, the sort of trajectory of the development of the software is they've slowly just been moving more and more of these modifiers to the GPU, with the obvious benefit that the things processed on the GPU are going to go a lot faster. There's a huge difference for certain types of effects, like fluids. Fluids on the GPU is many, many, many times faster than on the CPU. So in general, my advice would be, if the GPU version of a modifier is here, use that. And then for everything that doesn't have a GPU version, use the other version. Or If you're using a GPU version and you're running into some sort of glitch or error, then switch over to the CPU version. But I haven't really run into much of that. The GPU ones seem really stable, and yeah, not many issues. They just are a lot faster. So let's start to modify these particles a little bit with some very simple stuff. So let's do a scale modifier. So you can see, okay, let's not even push anything. Just click that one button, press play. All right, so you can see the particles are getting bigger over time. So this isn't such a cluttery thing to look at. Let's maybe make this a really thin and long emitter. And maybe let's just have a few less particles. Let's do like 300. There we go. All right, so the particles are just getting bigger. So you can see you've got your particles. It's got some default values and attributes. Add one modifier, and it will change that attribute. Position and order of operations, as far as I know, doesn't really make a huge difference when it comes to X particles for a lot of these effects. So like we just added this scale, and then let's add a color modifier also. And let's set this to, by default, if we just don't press anything, it's just gonna change the color to white. So instead of set color immediate, let's say gradient by parameter, and we'll just set this to the, actually we can set it to the radius. So you can see an example of the particles changing, but we need to lower the maximum based on one bit of data driving the next bit of data. So now we're changing the scale and we're changing the color. So let's add a turbulence modifier. And it's not that strong, so let's bump it up. Let's actually change this to here. And you can see that that's changing the position, or modifying the position. We're already starting with some movement, and now this is modifying that. Again, like I said, we're starting off super basic here. You got an emitter, you add some modifiers, and you get the particles to do something based on those modifiers. Each modifier has a sort of like a consolidated little list of parameters that you can tweak so that it's a very easy setup to get started with. All you need to do is make an emitter, throw a few modifiers on it. They're pretty self-explanatory, and you can start working with it just like that. I think that, if you're just getting started, a gotcha is that the default display type is squares, and it doesn't show the size of the particles. I've seen some people who are beginners kind of confused by that, not understanding how to make the particles bigger or smaller. But yeah, that's it. You just have to change the display type. Okay, so this is, again, the basics of just creating a particle and modifying it. So let's also now add our first generator, and we can do that. Let's select the emitter, and let's just click this guy to add some trails. If we do that, you can see that now each one of these particles has trails on it. Again, doing this in other software, of course you can do it, but doing it this easy and this fast, this is really what XParticles, this is like where it shines, is that this stuff is incredibly easy to set up and just really fast. So within the trails, this is one setting that these could be set to, which again, like I said, you're taking some information from the particles and you're using that to generate something. So here, obviously you're taking the frame by frame position of the particle and then using that information to draw this curve. If we change the algorithm to nearest by distance, you can see that we've got a different effect here, where all the particles are connected based on their distance to other particles. Let's come in here and let's change the particles display type to none for a second. Then we can just see this trails effect. Let's give ourselves some more time. And within that, it's set to nearest only. Let's say max number within a distance. So what this is going to do is every particle that is from 0 to 50 centimeters away from each other, it's going to draw a curve with a maximum of 5 curves per particle. And we get this sort of plexus kind of looking effect. Again, this super easy, really fast to set up, and it's all easy to change, very quick to modify, and really fast in the viewport, all that sort of stuff. If you've ever used Plexus in After Effects, you know that's a cool and popular effect. But being able to do a similar thing here in sort of like full 3D with all the connection to all the other stuff that you can do in 3D makes this really, really powerful. Seems really simple, but it's really powerful in terms of what you can sort of build on top of that. All right, and that's the basics of how this works. I don't want to drag this video out. I wanted this one to just be pretty quick and just give you a brief sort of overview of some of the stuff that just kind of, again, just how to wrap your head around XParticles. And then in subsequent videos, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into all these different things. But as I mentioned, I'm going to do a quick demo. So let's just start all over. And I'm just going to make something really quick and just kind of, again, the sort of point of this demo is just to show how quickly and easily you can make stuff that looks cool inside of XParticles. So I'm just going to make an emitter. I'm going to make a trails to go on that. I'm going to make turbulence, change this to curl noise, increase the scale of the curl noise and lower the frequency of that. Go into the emitter and let's go to the display and change this to gradient by parameter. We changed that with a modifier, but something this basic, a lot of times you just want to do it straight from the emitter because this is the thing that you're going to be doing all the time. So I think they wisely just went ahead and put this setting into the emitter so that you don't have to make a modifier for every single little thing. And what parameter do we want to change the particles to? Let's change it to, let's keep it at age and see what we get. Okay, so that might be, let's change the emitter type to a sphere. Maybe increase the size of it. Okay, and let's change our display type to circles. All right, and let's go into the emission And I'm gonna say this is 2.8 so that we can have a range of sizes in our particles. And the particles, oh yeah, they have a full lifespan right now. So going across their age isn't really gonna do anything because their age is sort of like just forever. So let's change this. Let's have their age be 260, I guess. Let's make it 120. And so then let's turn this off just so I can see. Okay. Cool. All right, so that looks pretty cool. So even just with this, which I'm sure you've seen this like a million times, this is just sort of like the obligatory X particles effect. Just throw some troll noise on some trails with some particles. Can't go wrong. So yeah, let's just take this thing that I made in like 2 seconds. There's only 3 different objects in here, and we'll just render this. And I guess I'll use Octane. You guys can let me know in the comments. This is probably like a poll thing. You know, what render engine are most of you using? Octane, Redshift, Standard, Cycles? I don't know. I mean, I'll like most of my tutorials will probably be using either Octane or Redshift, which is the main ones that I use. But I'm kind of curious, like between those two, which ones most people use. I have mostly used Octane, and I'm starting to slowly kind of move over to using Redshift more and more. But this time, let's just go ahead and do Octane. So on this trails, let's grab a Octane tag, and let's go to hair and say render as hair. And we're going to make a sphere. Let's change the sphere's radius to 1. And we're going to copy this guy, and then don't want to render that as hair. We're going to go in here and change this to geometry and drop this sphere in here. So now, if we render this with Octane, I'm not going to put any light in here. It'll still just be like a default sort of thing. But you can see everything's getting rendered in a very boring gray, but even with that, looks kind of interesting. Let's go in here and change our render settings really quick. Change this to path tracing. I'm gonna bump this down to 512 and change the GI clamp to 10 and increase parallel samples to 32. Okay, so now this is gonna render pretty fast. All right, so now let's go in here and let's make a few materials. Can just make a couple. So let's call this one trails, and this one will be for the particles. Let's drop this on here and drop this on here. And let's jump into the trails material. And so I want my trails to basically have the same color as the particles. So you have this attribute node, and you can see it's just set to color attrib 1, which is great. That's what we need. And we can just stick that into the albedo. And if we now render this again, you can see that our trails have the color of our particles. So that's great. And we're going to take this particle. Actually, I put that on the emitter. I want that to go on the sphere, actually. And so let's grab this guy. And here we're going to grab instance color and grab our emitter and drop that into here. And let's put that onto the color. And again, now our particles have some color, have the color of that they have in the emitter. So that's the most basic way to hook that up. But let's make this look a little bit more interesting. So we can start with the particles. So what I'm going to do is if we grab a random color node, and just to see what that's going to do, let's drop that into the albedo. And what you can see is that each particle gets a random grayscale value. So let's take that and pipe that into a octane gradient. And now what I can do, because what I want to do is I'm going to use this to make some of these particles glow, but I only want a few of them to glow. So what we're going to do is use the octane gradient to clamp down and make most of these particles black, but just a few of them white. We're going to take that now and multiply it by the regular instance color. Take both of these, make a texture emission, drop this into texture, turn on surface brightness, and let's bring the emission down quite a lot. And I'm just going to create a octane sky with just a black color in it. So now we can actually see those lights. We can adjust that how we want with the intensity. And then we can use this gradient to adjust how many lights are glowing. Very cool. So now I want to set up something similar with the trails also. So let's grab them. All right, so we've got our attribute here. So how do we get, it's going to turn that off for a second so we can see everything again. So how do we get a random color on each one of these trails? If we try and do the same thing, and let's grab a random color and drop that into the albedo, what you'll notice is that they're all the same color. If we change the random seed, you can see that all of these trails are basically being handled as a single object. I mean, they are a single object. So, all right, so cool. That's not going to work. So the answer is that you need to use this gradient down here, the Cinema 4D gradient. And if we drop that into the albedo, you will, let's see, is that working? That is working. Okay, so the thing is, I would have actually preferred it that didn't work. But as I was preparing this tutorial, I've already fixed it. So let's just pretend that didn't happen. And I'm going to go into the Octane settings, go to Cinema 4D shaders. This being checked is the default. So let's jump on the rewind machine again and pretend that didn't happen, because normally when you connect this gradient, you're going to get a similar thing. It's just going to be one color applied over the whole thing or nothing, basically. Actually, you've got a few things over here that are changed. Well, it's working, but it kind of typically doesn't work as well. And I don't know, maybe that just didn't update, because I don't think that normally. No, I think it's working. So maybe this is a change. It used to be that this didn't work. Maybe it works now. I don't know. So anyways, I'm not gonna struggle on that for too long. But used to be that you had to change this setting and here from which is the default, which generally you want this on. You want to keep that for most stuff, except if you're doing this. But who knows? It just kind of worked. So maybe I'm a liar and you don't need to do this. But either way, if you run into the problem where you put this gradient on here and it's putting one value over everything, then uncheck this and that will fix it. And you'll get something like this. Like it was still doing it before, but yeah, I mean, you can see here it's got like the full sort of grayscale range. I don't know. Anyway, so now we can do the same thing. We don't need to do the octane gradient in between here because we basically already have a gradient. So let's do a similar thing. And then we're gonna again take this and multiply it by this. Create emission, texture emission, put this into the texture, turn on surface brightness, and lower this quite a bit. Let's turn this back on. And you can see we've got something that looks pretty cool. And again, we can just kind of adjust how bright these are. We can adjust how many things are glowing. Maybe something like that will work. Then let's make an octane camera. And frame something up. Add all the cool things that are gonna make it look nice. Lots of depth of field. Throw some glow, some bloom. Maybe put it up and then start to cut some off. Let's go into the particles, maybe make a few more of those. Glow. You can go in here and also change, basically change these LUTs, get different looks like that. Or you can not mess with the LUTs and just turn on ACES and adjust the exposure, get different looks that way. Maybe I'll do some of that. And let's go in here. Turn this up even more. Maybe quite a bit. Maybe it'd be better to focus on one that's, well, yeah, you get the idea of sort of some of the stuff that you can do with this, and you can see just kind of how quick and easy that was. And we can go into our trails. Let's take the full sort of output of this and drop in a color correction. Let's put that into here also. And then we can change the hue and get a completely different set of colors in here. And of course, this is just, fun time playing with it. It's super fun to play with X particles. Another thing you can do is just drag around this white area. Like if there was a particle that you're like, I want that one to be lit up, then you can just move this around. There we go, something like that. So, I mean, I'm not gonna sit and try and make this too fancy because ultimately the point of this was just to show how quickly with X particles you can make something like this. And just have a ton of control over all these settings. And of course, you can do the same sort of thing like what I just did there in the particles, but just adding a image adjustment color corrector. Oops, didn't add it. Oh, what am I doing? Not there, right there. And pop that in there, and pop that into there. So yeah, lots of stuff that you can play with and have fun with. Very quick, very easy, and this is obviously just, you know, barely scratching the surface of what you can do with this. So we'll end it there for this one. And like I said, in future tutorials, we'll first start off very simple with just the basics. Basically, I'm going to be doing more. Here's how to do this thing in X particles. Here's how to make this cool effect in X particles. But I personally want to be able to point back to my own series of stuff when the questions ultimately roll in of like, well, how do I get started? Where's the beginner stuff? I'll be able to say, it's here. Look at this series where I just kind of very, very ground level talk about the emitter, probably like the most used modifiers, the most used generators, all that sort of stuff. So look forward to that in the next few videos. As usual with everybody who's doing this sort of thing, if you like this content, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell so that you get notified whenever a new video comes out. And let me know in the comments what else you want to see, what sort of content you want to see. And if it's something that I know how to do, then I'd be happy to put out some videos in that vein. So take care. Hope you learned something and see you in the next video.